How do you measure the economy under Trump? Is it measured by jobs, the stock market, recessions? Do you look at deficits or GDP? We put together a step-by-step breakdown of the Trump economy so you can make your own decision.
Today, I'm proud to declare that the United States is in the midst of an economic boom, the likes of which the world has never seen before.
That was before coronavirus and prior to the 2020 recession. Yet the stock market was already behind every Democratic president in the last 40 years, including Obama. Wage growth was stagnant, and Americans were already experiencing one of the largest federal budget deficits in history. Even GDP was low. So what happened? President Trump tweeted a lot about stock market records. But actually, every president in the last 40 years has presided over records, regardless of party. It's just what the market does. You may have heard that the market under Trump performed worse than every Democratic president in the last 40 years. That's true. But the fact is no Republican president has outperformed a Democrat since 1980. Many people will be quick to blame COVID-19 for the poor performance in the stock market. But while the pandemic hurt hardworking Americans, the market continued to climb. Despite all the hype, the markets under Trump never reached the performance of previous administrations. As of today, America has the highest unemployment rate ahead of an election. As you might have heard, much of the stimulus went to corporations, and unemployment is now double what it was when Trump took office. But how much of this is because of COVID-19? We went back and erased all of Trump's job losses since the pandemic began. At his greatest point, and before COVID, 6.7 million jobs were added to the economy. While that may sound like a lot, it's less than any single-term or double-term Democratic president in the last 100 years. Even Jimmy Carter added more jobs, and that was 40 years ago. Remember, this was during Trump's peak, before coronavirus and before the recession. In January, Trump will be the first president to leave the White House with fewer jobs than when he started. Perhaps the greatest measure of an economy is GDP, or the value of everything produced by a country. In 2016, President Trump promised GDP growth of 4, 5, and 6%. Unfortunately, in 4 years, GDP growth never surpassed 3%, and America witnessed the first negative GDP growth in over a decade. As a result, Trump became the first president since the Great Depression to never see GDP greater than 3%. In 2019, Trump's deficit topped $1 trillion, which marked a record for the biggest non-recession deficit in history. In 2020, the deficit surpassed $3 trillion, more than double the previous biggest deficit in U.S. history. Here's how the national debt works. The U.S. government doesn't have a savings account. It has a credit account, like your credit cards. Every month, the U.S. spends money on essential things, like Social Security and Medicare, and also a lot of non-essential things. Every month, the U.S. also makes interest payments to pay down the debt. Unfortunately, it spends more than it pays down. This year, America's deficit hit a record $3 trillion. That means the government debt is now $27 trillion. When Trump ran in 2016, his favorite scorecard was trade. He said everybody's cheating the U.S. and promised to negotiate deals the likes of which the world has never seen. But the tariffs failed, and eventually this put many farmers out of business. The trade deficit with China did not shrink. Instead, Trump's first 3 years in office were 3 of the 5 worst years in the history of the U.S.-China trade deficit. The trade war didn't end well for the U.S., and Trump eventually surrendered to China's demands. The deficit gradually got worse, and on October 6th of this year, Trump's own Commerce Department reported the largest U.S. trade deficits since 2006. The deficit ballooned to $67 billion, and in 2020, countries like Mexico saw their greatest surpluses against the U.S. in history. So where does all the money come from? All the new money in the system is just the government printing money with the president's signature on it. It's not Trump's money. It's not the government's money. And it's not earned money. It's money borrowed from hardworking taxpayers and printed out of thin air. That money belongs to citizens. In the last 4 years, taxpayers' money was squandered. 2020 was a difficult year for Americans, but the pandemic overshadowed the impact of Trump's economic policies. In 4 years, GDP plummeted, the stock market flatlined, wage growth remained stagnant, and Americans posted record job losses. The tariffs failed, deficits got bigger, homelessness peaks, and the debt ceiling was shattered. All in all, when measured by the numbers, the reality is Trump's economy has been the worst economy in the last 40 years.